The Native Women's Association of Canada reports that as of 2012, there were 582 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. An RCMP report in 2014 stated that there were 1,017 homicides of Indigenous women between 1980 and 2012. This means, on average, there are at least 2.6 deaths every month. The Canadian government's inquiry into the deaths and disappearances reveals that there are likely many, many more. I would like to share the history that explains why these deaths and disappearances are continuing to occur in Canada in record numbers, well above those of the non-Indigenous population. Please join me in honoring our stolen sisters by helping to make changes that will end this tragic violence. Because most of Canada's history books do not tell of the destructive colonial laws imposed on Indigenous peoples, many of us are unaware of the atrocities perpetrated against Indigenous people by our own government. Many people do not know that the Canadian government developed an aggressive campaign to assimilate Indigenous peoples into mainstream dominant society. In fact, laws were enacted to promote this domination. They called it the Indian Act. The Indian Act controlled most aspects of Indigenous people's lives and made it illegal to practice traditional beliefs and ceremonies or speak native languages. This has caused a loss of identity for many Indigenous people, and the repercussions of this is still felt today. With assimilation in mind, the Canadian government forced more than 150,000 Indigenous children from their homes and sent them far away to residential schools. They were forced from their parents and communities, and their traditional way of life was disrupted. They were forced to learn English and to practice Christianity. They were not allowed to speak their native language. This was traumatic for these children, causing mental and emotional anguish. As well, survivors reported physical and sexual abuse as well as extreme neglect. Indigenous peoples lived peacefully in Canada for centuries before European contact. Europeans were eager to settle here, and Indigenous peoples were welcoming and friendly, striking up mutually beneficial economic partnerships through the fur trade. As more Europeans began to settle, it became clear that they were encroaching on the once vast space where Indigenous peoples had enjoyed their traditional livelihoods of hunting and fishing. Colonial history has demonstrated that Europeans were eager to rid the land of Indigenous peoples as they were standing in the way of the development of prosperous industries. Canada has an abundance of valuable natural resources, ripe for lumber production, the mining of minerals, and oil extraction. Realizing the value of the land and the resources, the Canadian government began to quickly develop treaty agreements and convinced First Nations across the country to transfer ownership to the Canadian government in exchange for small reservations and some hunting and fishing rights. These small plots of land were not conducive to the traditional hunting and fishing, and it was at this point that a once nomadic people were forced into a sedentary lifestyle with no ability to make a living and few food sources. This began a cycle of poverty that remains in many First Nations communities today. The Canadian government acknowledged that these historical atrocities occurred. They admitted the truth to the world for the first time in 2008. Stephen Harper apologized to the families and survivors of the residential school system. He stated that the two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their homes, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. He said these objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as it was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. The fact is, nothing has changed since 2008, with the exception of the fact that we have more stolen sisters. Stephen Harper recognized the consequences of these actions when he said, "Today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country." The Government of Canada built an educational system in which very young children were often forcibly removed from their homes, often taken far from their communities. Many were inadequately fed, clothed, and housed. All were deprived of the care and nurturing of their parents, grandparents, and communities. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis languages and cultural practices were prohibited in these schools. Tragically, some of these children died while attending residential schools, and others never returned home. Stephen Harper stated publicly in his apology that the government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative, and that this policy has had a long-lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language. While some former students have spoken positively about their experiences at residential schools, these stories are far overshadowed by tragic accounts of the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse and neglect of helpless children and their separation from powerless families and communities. The legacy of Indian residential schools has contributed to social problems that continue to exist in many communities today. Amnesty International reports that it is the Indigenous women in Canada who have suffered the most. Statistics show that compared to non-Indigenous women, you are at a significant risk. If you are an Indigenous woman in Canada, your life expectancy is 5 years shorter, you are at least 5 times more likely to be murdered, you report 3 times the level of violent victimization, you are 3 times more likely to live in poverty, you are 3 times more likely to live in an unsafe or inadequate housing. There are also many other factors to consider. According to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Indigenous women have a higher vulnerability factor for abuse and even murder. That brief history helps us understand how historical injustices and their legacy leads us to our missing and murdered women and girls. According to the RCMP and many women's advocates groups, Indigenous women are at risk all across Canada. Indigenous leaders have been forced to warn women and young girls that they are at risk by posting signs along the highway cautioning them not to hitchhike or they are at risk of being kidnapped. Indigenous communities have joined forces to drag the Red River in Winnipeg as many Indigenous women have gone missing there. In remembrance, Indigenous artists have turned driftwood found along the banks of the Red River into art in order to heighten the awareness of the missing and murdered. The resilience of these strong First Nations peoples was not shaken, even faced with such oppression. They refused to assimilate and preserved their traditions, beliefs, and cultures. They have been their own advocates, resolutely determined to find justice with or without any help or support. They have lobbied the Canadian government. They have formed coalitions and organizations like the Native Women's Association of Canada and have drawn attention to the outside world. Violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada has passed the point of a crisis. Hundreds, if not thousands, are missing or have been murdered, and many others are suffering abuse at higher rates than non-Indigenous women in Canada. The Canadian government is failing to provide protection to these women, and according to many authoritative bodies, Canada is in violation of their human rights. Amnesty International states that the scale of severity of violence faced by Indigenous women and girls in Canada, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis constitutes a national human rights crisis. Canada has also been harshly criticized by a United Nations committee for a broad range of human rights failures, including an inadequate response to the problem of missing and murdered Aboriginal females. The commissioners concluded that the thousands of Indigenous women and girls who were murdered or disappeared in Canada are part of a genocide against Indigenous peoples through actions and inaction by governments that are rooted in colonialism. The final report is 1,200 pages long and makes 231 recommendations, listed as calls for justice. To date, there has been no justice. Why do we sit idly by, indifferent to the truth? We need to help. We can start our own campaigns. We can heighten awareness and keep the issue in the public eye. We can march. And we can aggressively lobby the Canadian government. We have the blood of murdered and missing women on our hands, Canada. What will your choice be? Turn your back now that you know the truth, or act now and save lives? I know what my choice will be. I will stand in solidarity with Indigenous people in honor of the murdered and missing women and girls. To them I say, I will remember you. I will help find you. And I will help fight for justice with you. No more stolen sisters.